Well, thank you. This is a very good turnout. I was told 20-some people, and it looks like, to me, eyeballing it closer to 30. And thank you for showing up. So, you've already heard what my talk is about. I decided to come up with this title, Cutting Federal Government Spending. Yes, we did. Let me explain that. But before I explain that, I want to show you a picture I'm kind of proud of. That's me with the man. I was a senior economist for 2 years at the Council of Economic Advisors, 82 to 84. And this isn't then. This is in his office in Century City in January 93. And why am I showing that other than to kind of brag about it? Because I want to tell you about something a lot of people have forgotten about if they never, and they may have never have known. Barbara Walters had this tradition of doing an interview at Thanksgiving with whoever the sitting president was. And she did an interview with him at Thanksgiving 1981, his first year in office. And remember, that was during the Cold War. The Cold War wasn't at its peak, but it was pretty hot. I don't know. It was up there. And Barbara Walters asked Reagan about the Soviet threat and the threat to our freedom. And Reagan's answer I will never forget, even though, by the way, I cannot find it on YouTube and I can't find a transcript, but I remember it. He said the biggest threat to our freedom is not the Soviets, it's our own governments. And he meant state, local, and federal. And one of his goals was to try to rein in the federal government. I don't think, by the way, he was that successful. He had some successes, but as we'll see, there were other successes under a different president, and we're going to talk about that. So I did a study for Mercatus called Canada's Budget Triumph. I'm originally from Canada, And the only time my wife knows that is when I'm cheering for the Canadian Olympic team. Other than that, I'm a straight American now. And I did a study in which I showed that in Canada, they'd had this amazing success from the mid-90s to the early 2000s in cutting their federal spending. And by the way, it was under the Liberal Party, which is kind of, if you want to put it in U.S. terms, it's kind of like the left wing, the moderate to left wing of the Democratic Party here, and yet they managed to have all these cuts, mainly in domestic spending. So I want to show you what they did. Federal spending on programs as a percent of GDP fell from 17.5% to 11.3% 8 years later. That's a pretty amazing number. And that means not only did they cut the rate of growth of spending of many programs, they actually cut spending in dollar terms, in nominal dollar terms, not just real dollar terms, nominal dollar terms. That's program spending. What's program spending? It's all spending except on interest on the debt. Here's how they did on servicing the federal debt. That fell from 5.6% to 4.3% over 7 years. And so both of those fell, but of course their main accomplishment was on the domestic program spending side. Well, then the question is, what is a cut? And what I've learned over the years is people, when they talk about cuts in government spending, it means different things to different people. And so here are really 4 things it can mean. A cut in the dollar amount of spending, even when there's inflation. So that'll be a real cut, an even bigger real cut if there's any inflation. A cut in real spending, that is an inflation adjusted. A cut in spending as a percent of GDP. And a cut in the planned increase in spending. And that's this little game that they sometimes play. They plan for 10 and then they make it 5 and they say we cut by 5. Well, what do I mean? Well, throughout the paper, unless I say different, I mean number 3. A cut in spending as a percent of GDP. And the really good news here, and we're going to talk about this later, is that you can just by restraining the growth of spending and have it grow more slowly than GDP, you will necessarily cut spending as a percent of GDP. Can it happen here? The major criticism of my Canadian study, and I gave a talk on it in a Capitol Hill campus a few years ago, and I got this criticism, and I basically thought, well, the criticism's right, because I hadn't looked at the American data. And the criticism was that we can't do the same thing here, because we have divided government. In Canada, just to fill you in a little, they have a parliamentary system, much like Britain's parliamentary system. So you have a legislative branch that also is the executive branch. So when you have a majority government in Parliament, as they do now, once they've decided on what their budgets are going to be, that's it. And they just tell all the backbenchers, vote for this, and backbenchers do vote for it, and that's the end of it. So all the bargaining happens internally in coming up with those numbers. There's not a lot of public bargaining, and they just agree on it and they do it, and that's what they did so successfully the last half of the 90s. Well, it turns out, and so you might think, well, it can't happen here because we've got divided government. We've got, first of all, two branches that are relevant here. I'm putting aside the judicial. One's the executive, one's the legislative, and even if they're from the same party, those are different branches. But also we often have them be from different parties. Well, my evidence is that it can happen here, and the evidence is from the 1990s. And I think the story has been undertold. But here it is in one graph. And so I'm calling this, my Canadian article was titled Canada's Budget Triumph, so I'm calling this America's Budget Triumph. Look at federal spending as a percent of GDP in 1990, and then look what happened by 2000. Federal spending was cut by 3.63% of GDP. That's not a cut of 3.63%, which would be trivial. That's 3.63% of GDP, from 21.85% to 18.22%, which means it was a 16.6% reduction in the share of GDP spent by the federal government, which is a 1/6 reduction. Okay, where did it happen? Well, over 60% of the drop was in defense. So I've been watching a lot of NBA games. I said defense. Defense, as Catherine Zeta-Jones would say. So here's defense spending as a percent of GDP over the 90s. And what's the story there? Well, we called it the peace dividend. 1989, November 1989, the Berlin Wall falls, and then the U.S. negotiates with the Soviets about, can we reunite Germany, and we will agree not to expand NATO. By the way, that agreement was later broken, but we will agree not to expand NATO, and you guys agree that you won't intervene, and we'll just have a peaceful resolution. And that happened. And so Bush and his defense secretary, does anyone remember who Bush's defense secretary was? Dick Cheney. They got together and they said, we don't need such a large defense budget. So they put the United States defense budget on a glide path to have a fairly gradual reduction, and it worked. So Clinton comes in January 93, and he doesn't really mess with it. He pretty much leaves it as is, and that happens. So we get to a much lower percent of GDP spent on defense. Defense. And I have a couple other graphs that will be in the paper. I didn't want to get into too much detail, but it shows just various things that were cut in defense. Like, for example, we cut the number of aircraft carriers by a few, and we still have 11. And just to put that in perspective, China, which I teach military officers at the Naval Postgraduate School. A large percent of my officers, of course, are Navy. And a lot of people in the Navy, including admirals very high up, worry a lot about China. And just to put that in perspective, China has one aircraft carrier. So there's this glide path I talked about, and that kind of worked out. The second most important category in which we saw a reduction in spending as a percent of GDP was interest as a percent of the debt. That fell also. Now, that was not due mainly to a drop in interest rates. It was to a drop in principal, essentially, a drop in the debt. And again, not even in dollar terms, not in real terms, but rather as a percent of GDP. So that was and you see that the net result was net interest fell substantially as a percent of GDP. Well, okay, what have we not talked about? What we've not talked about is domestic spending. That also saw a decline, and just to put that in perspective, it's a different graph I'm not showing here, but from 1990 to 2000, domestic spending fell from 13.18% of GDP to 12.78%. So that's a small drop. That's 0.4% of GDP. But in a way, that's kind of a bit of a success in itself. There's a famous short story, a Sherlock Holmes short story, called The Blaze, in which the clue that Sherlock Holmes figures out is that the dog didn't bark. And so defense spending falling only slightly at a time when most people expected it to increase substantially with expansions in Medicaid especially, that was really somewhat of a success. So now let's look at the components. The green number on top is overall what I call the big three: Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security spending as a percent of GDP. Notice it goes up from 1990 to 2000, but it goes up and then falls a little in the last few years of the 90s. And one big reason is GDP is growing faster than usual in the last few years of the 90s, so it's the denominator. Social Security goes up and then falls. Medicaid goes up because of expansions in eligibility in the late 80s, early 90s. And Medicare goes up and then falls a little. Why does it fall a little? I'm still not sure. I've been researching that. And the best I can tell, one of the other untold success stories in the U.S. economy is something that everyone liked to kind of beat on, but that was managed care. If you look at the 90s, managed care was tremendously successful at restraining the growth of private health care spending as a percent of GDP. State legislators bit by bit overturned it. Legislatures overturned it, but it was somewhat of a success, and Medicare maybe tracked that. But there was one other clear-cut accomplishment. And by the way, I guess I've kind of told you I'm judging this as an accomplishment when you cut. So that's my bias. And so let me look at this other accomplishment, and that is domestic spending. It fell from 6.41% of GDP to 5.40. In other words, a full percentage point drop. And by the way, I think there's room for more of a cut there. And by the way, it's gone up since then. There's room for more of a cut. Now, those are all ratios. When you talk about spending as a percent of GDP, you're talking about a ratio. There are two reasons a ratio can fall. One is the numerator falls, and the other is the denominator increases. So the denominator is GDP, and we had GDP growth. Here was the biggest surprise I found in my research. Usually you go into a research and you already kind of have your priors. You have what you expect to find. And I found cuts, which wasn't surprising because I knew all those cuts had occurred. But what I thought was true was that one of the main reasons for the cut in the percent of spending as a percent of GDP is that GDP grew unusually fast. Well, it didn't. Average annual economic growth, real GDP, by decade, it averaged 3.2% over 1990s, 3.2% in the 1980s, and 3.2% in what everyone thought was the horrible decade, the 1970s. So, yes, the denominator is growing, but it's not growing unusually quickly or unusually high rate. Now, one of the things we often hear from critics of spending cuts is that those spending cuts will hurt the economy. And what they have in mind is some kind of a Keynesian model if you think back, who here took an economics course in college at some point? Okay, so you probably got somewhere in there this Keynesian model, C plus I plus G, consumption expenditures plus investment expenditures plus government expenditures in goods and services. And if government is cutting G, then aggregate demand falls. Well, some percent of the profession, economics profession, is Keynesian. A large percent are not. I don't know how it balances out. But the point is we kind of moved away from Keynesianism because it didn't seem to explain a lot of the facts. And here's another one it doesn't explain. Here we have government spending falling as a percent of GDP, including government spending on goods and services, and yet we don't have a reduction in the growth rate of GDP, which, by the way, is what I found when I looked at the Canadian experience also. And in fact, here's the last half of the 90s. Remember I said that the average growth through the 90s was 3.2%. The average growth in the last half of the 90s was 4.0%. That's real terms. If Obama would kill for 4% growth. I mean, man, so many problems would get so much easier. Unemployment, deficits, debt, and so on. Okay. We also hear that in Canada, I mentioned that in Canada they have a parliamentary system. So, well, are these cuts due to the president and Congress being from the same party? Well, no. 1990 to 92, Republican president, Democratic Congress. 1993 to 94, Democratic president, Democratic Congress. So 2 years where it's the same. 1995 to 2000, Democratic president, Republican Congress. So they, even with divided government for 8 of those 10 years, they managed to cut. And part of it, as I said, just to review, it was on the foreign policy side, the defense spending side, it was Bush and Cheney implementing the cuts, Clinton coming in and essentially keeping that programmatic thing going. And then the Republican Congress comes in January 95 and actually succeeds in restraining Clinton on the domestic spending side. So that's a piece of what's going on. There's a bigger example of a peace dividend that helped and didn't hurt the economy. And this relates to another study I did for Mercatus a few years ago. And that is the cuts in defense spending as a percent of GDP during World War II. So if you think that those cuts in the 90s were something, take a look at the 40s. The peak spending of the federal government as a percent of GDP was in 1944, when they spent approximately 44% of GDP. So to put that in perspective, with our GDP now, if they spent 44%, they would be spending over $7 trillion a year, close to 8. Okay, and yet, in a less than a 3-year period, they cut that from 44 down to around 10. That's an amazing cut in a very short time. Any idea how high the unemployment rate went? Because Keynesians like Paul Samuelson were predicting it's going to be as bad as or worse than the Great Depression. Great Depression, to recall, unemployment rate hits a high of 25% in 1933. So anyone got a guess about how high unemployment rate went during this time?
7%.
4. It never made it up to 4. It was like 3.8, 3.9. Amazing. But thank you for being straight man here. I appreciate that. And now, let me just, so then the question, so if we measure by unemployment, there wasn't this big recession. If you look at the government data on GDP, there was a big recession. But my parents grew up, or they were young adults during the Second World War. I grew up in Canada. but it was very similar, big drop in defense spending, similar to here. So I've talked to many Americans of that generation. I've talked to, including many economists. I've talked to many people of my generation growing up, and no one I talked to thought that they were in a recession, even though the government's measures said they were. And that's because there was this dramatic shift from government spending to private spending. So if you look at actual GDP, it looks lower, but people are buying stuff they value, like houses, cars, fuel, tires, electric ranges, and so on. And so I call it, which you're going to believe, the data or your own lying eyes. And so then if we look at a piece of data that kind of tells us something, look at the growth of real private GDP, and you can see it was huge after World War II. So the message here is, I think you should be highly skeptical of the claim that when you cut government spending, you're going to put the economy in recession or even slow the growth rate. And look at what happened, by the way. Paul Krugman of the New York Times a year ago said, well, we've got this test. We've got the sequester, and we're going to have really slow growth. And now he denies that he ever said that was a test, because what happened? We didn't get slow growth. So the moral of the story is that modest cuts in spending in real terms, combined with keeping growth in spending below growth in GDP when you don't actually cut it in dollar or real terms, will ultimately balance budgets and even produce budget surpluses. So, of course, then the question is where the cuts can be made. And here it gets trickier than what they faced in the 90s. So let me say something about that. Defense spending today is about 3.8% of GDP. So it's below what it was when Bush starts cutting in the 90s, and it was 5.2%. Is there still room to cut defense spending substantially? I think there is, substantially. But it does require that we rethink how major a role in the world the U.S. government and U.S. military should have. But the growth in government spending in the future will mainly be in Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security. So it will be very hard to get something close to the results of the 90s without restraining the growth in those things. Let me just say a couple of words about how that might be done. I think the only way you can do it is what we call in prospect. In other words, if you try to cut spending now on those things, so for the next year, you're going to have lots of opposition. If you try to cut it in prospect and you say, starting in this, 2 years out, there's this little cut, maybe de-indexing by 1%, those kinds of things, so you give people time to adjust, you've got a better shot at it. It's not a sure thing by any means. Look at what happened with the recent small attempt to cut veterans benefits, which I thought made a lot of sense, and now it's been reversed. But the point is, that's how you have to do it. I went over my talk this morning in my hotel room and realized there's a slide I wish I had developed. So I want to just tell a story that's going to be roughly accurate. Because I have the numbers somewhere, but I don't have them handy. Who here has heard of David Stockman? All right. Budget director under Reagan, real firebrand, right? So where did Reagan get hammered that first year? On Social Security. Stockman, the early retirement benefit, if you retired at age 62 on Social Security, was 80% of the full benefit at age 65. Stockman tried to reduce that from 80% to 55% for people retiring in a couple of years. So they're going to lose a third of the benefit they expected, and it's going to be a year or two away? It was DOA, as they say. There was no way. And so Stockman kind of he reined himself in, or he got reined in, and not much happened. But what was the program he fought off? And this is what is not as well known. That was in a congressional initiative with both Republicans and Democrats. It looked like it would be a bipartisan success. It would have raised the retirement age in stages to 68 by the year 2000, which, remember, is 14 years ago. And what did we get out of the Social Security Commission? We got it raised in stages to 67 by the year 2020-something. And that's just kind of amazing when you think about it. And there was this famous interview with David Stockman in The Atlantic by a guy named William Grider, and people had their various things they liked to quote. No one liked to quote the one I like to quote, because Grider asked him about this attempt to cut Social Security really quickly in the short run, and he said, quote, "Why should I try to solve the problem of the guy who has this job in 2010? Well, guess what? 2010 was 4 years ago, and I would have loved him to solve the problem of the guy who had the job in 2010. So you've got to go after those kinds of things, and that's a way to do it. Let me say something, though, about the debt. Net interest on the debt, even though the debt is very high, net interest is very low because interest rates are very low. The danger is this: it's kind of asymmetric. Interest rates are unlikely to go much lower, but there's a reasonable chance they'll go higher. $12 trillion in debt, roughly, is not held by other government agencies. So a 1 percentage point increase in interest rates on $12 trillion in debt is $120 billion, which is 0.75% of GDP. So if interest rates go up much, that's a real problem. And there's not really good news here, but I just think you should know the news even when it's bad news. A solution is to lock in what are relatively low long-term rates so that when short-term rates spike up, you're saving money. However, that solution necessarily costs the Feds money in the short run, because the interest rates on long-term, on 30-year bonds, are roughly 3 points, maybe a little below 3 points, up to 300 basis points above the short term. So I wouldn't say refinance at all. You want to diversify your strategy. So if you refinance $2 trillion of it, which is a substantial number, you're still going to pay 3 percentage points more. So on $3 trillion, that's $90 billion. Nevertheless, I think that's a good measure. We've got this great opportunity right now to do it. But of course, that's a hard sell. But I think it's a good measure. So, can we cut federal spending? Yes, we can. Thank you. And I will take questions.